2 silver bracelets, 3 interlinked hearts, a tiny lighthouse charm at the center. Only 2 of these bracelets existed in the entire world, and Clare Reed knew exactly where they were supposed to be, on the wrists of her daughters, who had been missing for 15 years. So when she looked across a crowded room one October night and saw those bracelets on 2 strangers, what happened in the next 60 seconds would shatter everything those 2 women thought they knew about their own lives. That is exactly what happened to Clare Reed. And what unfolded in the hours, days, and months that followed would shake an entire community to its core, reopen a case that investigators had quietly shelved, and force everyone involved, including 2 young women who had no idea who they really were, to confront a truth so devastating, so impossible, that it nearly broke every single person it touched. This is the story of Abigail and Hannah Reed, the bracelet girls, missing for 15 years, found in the most unlikely place imaginable. Stay with me, because this story does not go where you think it goes. Before we go any further, if this is your first time joining us here at Cold Crime Case, hit that subscribe button right now and hit that notification bell. We cover the cases that stay with you, the stories that remind you that the truth is always stranger than anything we could invent. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever experienced a moment where the past and the present collided in a way you never saw coming? I want to hear from you. And share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Someone out there might know more than they realize. Now, let us go back to the beginning. The town of Harroway's Point sits on the northern Pacific coast, tucked between a narrow stretch of shoreline and a dense wall of Douglas fir that climbs the hillside behind it. It is the kind of town that most people drive through without stopping: a post office, a diner, a hardware store, a small marina where the fishing boats go out before dawn and come back smelling of brine and diesel. Population: just under 3,000 people, depending on the season. In the summer months, the population swells slightly. Artists come for the light, retirees come for the quiet, families come for the beaches that most tourists have not yet discovered. But when autumn hits and the fog rolls back in off the water, Harroway's Point contracts again. The visitors leave, the locals pull inward, and the town becomes, once again, the small, self-contained world that the people who were born there have always known. Clare and Daniel Reed were not born in Harroway's Point, but they had come close. Daniel grew up 40 minutes down the coast in a slightly larger town and had moved to Harroway's Point at the age of 26 for a job with the county environmental office. Clare had followed him 2 years later, leaving behind a paralegal job in Portland and a life that, she would later admit, had never felt quite right. Harroway's Point felt right. The pace of it, the smallness of it, the way you could walk to the water in 7 minutes from almost anywhere in town, all of it felt like something she had been looking for without knowing she was looking. They married in the summer of Daniel's 29th year, in a small ceremony at the marina with 22 guests. Clare wore a dress she had found at a consignment shop in Astoria and carried wildflowers she had picked herself from the hillside that morning. They were, by every account from those who knew them, genuinely happy people, not in the showy, performative way that sometimes masks something darker underneath. Just quietly, solidly, genuinely happy. In the autumn of 2001, Clare gave birth to twin daughters, Abigail Marie Reed and Hannah Grace Reed. They arrived 11 minutes apart on a Thursday morning, and the doctor who delivered them would later tell the nurses that he had rarely seen a father cry quite so hard as Daniel Reed did in that delivery room. The girls were, from the very beginning, a matched set in almost every way. Dark blonde hair that caught the light and turned honey gold in summer, wide-set eyes, hazel in Hannah and a slightly greener shade in Abigail, button noses, strong, stubborn chins that they got from Clare's side. They were the kind of twins who did not need to speak to communicate. A glance between them could carry an entire conversation, and the people around them sometimes felt, not unpleasantly, like they were watching a private language being spoken in real time. They were spirited children. Hannah was the louder of the two, the one more likely to announce herself, to climb the tallest thing available, to ask the question that nobody else thought to ask. Abigail was quieter but no less determined. She was the planner, the one who thought 3 steps ahead, the one who, at the age of 5, organized the household's collection of seashells by size and color, and then wrote small paper labels for each category in her careful, oversized handwriting. Together, they were a force of nature. Separately, their parents sometimes said they were incomplete versions of themselves, not in a troubling way, just in the way that some people are born with their other half already walking beside them. Claire and Daniel did everything parents do. They coached soccer and packed lunches and argued gently about screen time and drove to school concerts in the dark of winter mornings. They were members of the community in the fullest sense, present, engaged, known. The Reed family was the kind of family that Harroway's Point was built around, rooted, stable, permanent. And then on October 14th, 2009, everything ended. It was a Wednesday. The girls were 7 years old. They had just celebrated their birthday 2 weeks earlier, on the last day of September. Claire had taken the afternoon off work to pick them up from school, as she did on the days that Daniel worked late. The school, Harroway's Point Elementary, was a single-story building 4 blocks from the harbor, and the walk home on clear days took about 12 minutes through a route that wound past the marina and along the waterfront path. It was not a clear day. The fog was thick that afternoon, the kind of October fog that settles in before noon and does not lift until the following morning. Claire was 8 minutes from the school when her phone rang. It was a parent she knew from the soccer team, calling about a schedule change. She took the call while she walked, pausing briefly on the corner of Harbor and Spruce to hear the details over the wind. She was on the phone for approximately 4 minutes. She arrived at the school at 3:17, 2 minutes after the official dismissal time. The teachers were still outside. Most of the children were still milling around on the sidewalk, but Abigail and Hannah were not there. Claire was not immediately alarmed. The girls sometimes walked ahead to the marina when she was running late. They loved to watch the boats, and the marina was on the route home. She thanked the teacher on duty and walked quickly to the marina. The girls were not there either. She called Daniel. She walked back toward the school. She asked other parents if they had seen the twins. Nobody had. Daniel arrived at the school within 15 minutes, his truck still running when he jumped out of it. By 4 o'clock, with the fog pressing in and the light failing, they called the police. The Harroway's Point Police Department was small, 6 officers total, with a sheriff who had been in the role for 11 years. Deputy Roderick Marsh was the first to respond, arriving at the school at 4:14. He listened to Claire's account, noted the timeline, radioed the other deputies, and immediately requested support from the county sheriff's office. Within 40 minutes, there were 9 officers on the ground. They searched the waterfront path. They searched the marina. They searched the woods at the edge of town where the children sometimes played. They knocked on doors. They checked the homes of the girls' school friends. They found nothing. By 9 o'clock that night, the county had formally declared Abigail and Hannah Reed missing persons. The FBI was notified. An Amber Alert was issued. Volunteers showed up at the community center before sunrise the next morning, 416 of them, and organized themselves into search teams without being asked. The entire town of Harroway's Point, and much of the surrounding county, spent the next 72 hours searching every inch of accessible land and coastline. They found nothing. Not a shoe, not a backpack, not a hair ribbon, not a single physical trace that told them where 2 7-year-old girls had gone in the space of 4 minutes on a foggy Wednesday afternoon. It was as though the coast had simply swallowed them. The investigation that followed was, by any measure, exhaustive. The FBI's Crimes Against Children unit sent 2 agents to Harroway's Point within 36 hours of the disappearance. A task force was formed combining federal agents, county detectives, and state police investigators. Every registered sex offender within 150 miles was interviewed. Every family member and friend of the Reeds was interviewed. Every teacher, coach, neighbor, and parent from the girls' school was interviewed. Daniel Reed was, as the spouse always is in cases of missing children, a person of interest in the early days of the investigation. He submitted to interviews. He passed a polygraph. He cooperated fully and without reservation, and investigators ultimately cleared him of any suspicion within the first 3 weeks. Clare Reed was also interviewed extensively, her account verified in every detail. The phone call she had received while walking to school was confirmed. The 4-minute duration was confirmed. The parent who had called her corroborated the conversation exactly. There was nothing there. The investigation turned outward. Tips flooded in from across the country. A psychic from Arizona wrote a letter claiming the girls were in a cabin in the mountains of Northern California. A man in Nevada called to say he had seen 2 children matching their description at a roadside diner. A woman in British Columbia reported seeing twin girls being led through a ferry terminal by a man who seemed nervous. Every single tip was followed up. Every single lead ran cold. What the investigators had was essentially nothing. No witnesses, no physical evidence, no suspects, no motive that they could identify. The girls had vanished from a 4-minute window on a foggy afternoon in a small town where everybody knew everybody, and the world had simply produced no explanation for it. The local media covered the case intensively for the first 6 months. National outlets picked it up in the early weeks, drawn by the image of twin girls, the identical Christmas card smiles, the dark blonde hair, the photograph that Clare Reed released to the press showing both girls holding up their left wrists to display the silver bracelets their grandmother had given them the previous Christmas. 3 interlinked hearts, a tiny lighthouse charm dangling from the center. Custom made by a jeweler in Astoria. Only 4 pairs made. 1 for the girls, 1 for Clare and Daniel, stored in a drawer at home. 1 sold to a family whose address the jeweler could provide but whose whereabouts had been checked and cleared. And 1 whose buyer's information had been lost when the jeweler updated his record-keeping system the following spring. That 4th pair of bracelets would become, for 15 years, the single most haunting detail of the entire case. The years that followed the disappearance reshaped Clare Reed into someone unrecognizable from the woman she had been before. Not unrecognizable in a broken way, she did not collapse, did not disappear into grief or substance or silence. She got up every morning. She went to her job at the county planning office, where she had worked since the girls were toddlers. She attended community events. She answered every reporter's question with the same careful, measured hope she had trained herself to maintain. But the woman who had walked to that school on October 14th, 2009, the one who paused on a foggy corner to take a phone call, the one who was 8 minutes from her daughters and then was not, that woman was gone. In her place was someone who had been permanently reconfigured by loss. Someone who carried the weight of an unanswered question every single hour of every single day. She and Daniel remained together, which many people noted with some surprise. The statistics on marriages surviving the disappearance of a child are grim, and the disappearance of 2 children is a weight that few partnerships can bear. But Clare and Daniel held. Not easily, not without periods of tremendous strain, but they held. Perhaps because neither of them was willing to lose one more thing. Perhaps because in the absence of everything else, they were what the other person had. Every year on October 14th, Clare posted a message on social media with the girl's photograph. Every year she updated the missing persons listings with new age progression images produced by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, showing what Abigail and Hannah might look like at 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 21. She kept the case page current. She answered messages from people who thought they had seen the girls in grocery stores and airports, and on buses in cities across the country. She drove herself twice, across 2 state lines, to investigate sightings that turned out to be nothing. She never stopped, not for 15 years, not for a single day. And the bracelets. She thought about the bracelets constantly. She had gone back to the jeweler a dozen times over the years, pressing him to search his old records for any trace of that fourth sale. She had hired, at her own expense, a private investigator to track the missing record. She had filed requests with the FBI to cross-reference the bracelet design against any recovered evidence in any jurisdiction in the country. Nothing. The bracelets were the one tangible thread in the entire 15-year silence, and the thread led nowhere. Until it did. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment below right now that says, "I am still here." Let me see who is truly following this story with me, because what happens next is the part that will shake you. We are only halfway through, and the truth is about to get a great deal more complicated than you may be expecting. Subscribe if you have not already. This community shows up for every case. Let us keep going. The night of the art fair was a Saturday in late October of 2024, 15 years and 12 days after Abigail and Hannah Reed disappeared. Claire had almost not gone. She had been tired that week, a difficult stretch at work, a head cold that had lingered for 10 days, a general flatness that sometimes descended on her in October, as it always did in October, as it probably always would. Daniel had been the one to insist. The neighbor's daughter, 17-year-old Macy Calloway, the granddaughter of the family who had lived 3 houses down from the Reeds for 20 years, was showing her watercolor landscapes for the first time at the annual coastal art fair held in the community center. They had promised they would be there. Claire owed it to the Calloways. She pulled on her coat and went. The community center was warm and busy. It smelled of coffee and wood shavings, and the faint sultan pine that was the permanent background scent of Harroway's Point. Local artists had their work displayed on screens and pedestals around the room. Macy's watercolors hung near the west wall, quiet, confident landscapes of the coastline, painted in the soft gray blues of the actual sky rather than the postcard bright version tourists expected. Claire had praised them genuinely, and was now standing near the pottery display on the far side of the room, half listening to Daniel discuss the season's salmon run with an older man from the fishing collective. She was tracing the rim of a ceramic bowl, seafoam green, beautifully fired, when laughter cut across the ambient noise of the room. 2 young women, standing before a textile installation maybe 15 feet away. Dark blonde hair pulled back in identical low ponytails. Matching denim jackets, not the same jacket, she would later note, but the same style, like they had shopped together and reached for the same thing. They were laughing at something in the installation, one of them gesturing with both hands in the exaggerated way you do when you are telling a story to someone who already knows all the characters. And then they turned. Claire's hand went still on the bowl. Both young women wore a delicate silver bracelet on their left wrist. Even from 15 feet away, even in the warm, slightly uneven light of the community center, Claire could see it. 3 interlinked hearts, a tiny lighthouse charm hanging from the center. The room did not tilt exactly. It was more as though the room continued exactly as it was, and Claire's body went somewhere else entirely. Some cold, airless place where time had no direction, and the only thing in the world was the image in front of her. She gripped Daniel's arm. Her knuckles went white against the navy of his sweater. "Daniel," her voice came out as almost nothing. "Look at those 2 women, their bracelets." Daniel looked. His expression traveled through 3 different things in 3 seconds: curiosity, confusion, something closer to horror. "Claire, that's—" "I know what it is," she said, and she was already moving. What happened next Clare Reed would later describe, in the interview she gave to investigators, as the longest walk of her life. The room was not large. The distance was not significant, but crossing it felt, she said, like walking through water. Like every step was both the most important thing she had ever done and the thing she was most afraid of. The taller of the 2 young women noticed her coming first. She turned with the easy, open expression of someone who expects nothing unusual and offered a polite smile. "Hi there, are you enjoying the fair?" Claire stopped in front of them, her mouth opened. For a moment, nothing came out at all. She looked at the bracelets, she looked at their faces, she looked at the bracelets again. "I'm sorry," she managed. Her voice was shaking so badly she could hear it herself. "Your bracelets, where did you get them?" The young women exchanged a glance. The fast, private glance of people who have spent their entire lives reading each other. The shorter one, whose eyes were a striking shade of hazel, touched her wrist, protective, instinctive. "They were gifts from our father." When Claire pressed, she stepped closer. She could feel Daniel's hand on her shoulder, a warning, gentle, asking her to slow down, and she shook it off without looking at him. "When did he give them to you?" "We've had them since we were kids," the taller one said. Her tone had shifted slightly, not unfriendly but careful now. "Is there a problem?" Claire's hands would not stop shaking. She pulled her phone from her purse, nearly dropping it, and scrolled through her photos with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. She found the photograph in the folder she had kept for 15 years, the one she updated every year, the one she had sent to FBI agents and private investigators and the producers of 3 different true crime programs. She turned the screen toward them. 2 7-year-old girls, dark blonde hair, matching summer dresses, both holding up their left wrists toward the camera, both wearing a silver bracelet. 3 interlinked hearts, a lighthouse charm. "These are my daughters," Claire said. Her voice broke on the last word. "Abigail and Hannah Reed. They vanished 15 years ago." The color left both young women's faces at the same moment. The taller one stepped back half a step, her hand moving to grip her companion's arm. "I don't understand," she said. The words came out slowly, as though she were testing each one before releasing it. And in that moment, in the 10 seconds of silence that followed those 3 words, 15 years of impossible waiting arrived at the door of something that might, finally, be an answer. What happened in the next hour inside that community center would later be reconstructed carefully and thoroughly by investigators, and pieced together through the accounts of Clare Reed, Daniel Reed, the 2 young women, and the 4 bystanders who noticed that something significant was unfolding and remained close enough to observe. Clare Reed held up her phone with the photograph and asked the 2 young women to look at it closely. Not accusatorially. She was not shouting. She was not grabbing anyone. She was, and this, multiple witnesses confirmed, was remarkable given what she was experiencing, completely controlled. The kind of control that comes not from calmness but from the absolute, focused determination of someone who has spent 15 years preparing for a moment they were terrified might never come. The taller young woman, who would later be identified for the record as using the name Rachel, stared at the photograph for a long time without speaking. The shorter young woman, who went by the name Lily, had turned away slightly. One hand pressed flat against her sternum, like she was trying to hold something in place inside her chest. "Our father gave us these bracelets," Rachel said again. She was working through something. You could see it in her face. "He told us, he said they were our mother's, that she had wanted us to have them." Clare Reed stood completely still. "He told us she died," Lily said, without turning back around. Her voice was very quiet. "When we were little, he told us she died when we were 4. The silence that followed was the kind that does not need to be described. Every person who was close enough to hear it understood immediately what was happening. And what was happening was something that most people only encounter in the kind of stories they never expect to be standing inside of. Daniel Reed reached around his wife and took her phone gently from her hand. He looked at the 2 young women. He looked at the photograph. He looked at them again. "What is your father's name?" he asked. Rachel and Lily exchanged another glance. This one was different from the earlier ones. This one was frightened. "Thomas," Rachel said. "Thomas Vale." The name Thomas Vale meant nothing to Clare or Daniel Reed. It meant nothing to Deputy Sheila Cortez, who arrived at the community center 22 minutes later after Daniel made the call. It meant nothing, initially, to the county detective who took the case the following morning. It meant a great deal, however, to the FBI agent who pulled up the name in the national database at 9:47 on a Sunday morning, 40 hours after the bracelet encounter at the community center. Thomas Vale was a name the Federal Missing Persons Network had come across before, not in connection with the Reed girls specifically, not in connection with any disappearance at all, in fact. He was in the database because of a civil dispute from 2012, a custody matter in a state that will remain unnamed pending the ongoing legal proceedings, a custody matter that had been closed on paper without resolution. The thread was thin. The investigators pulled it anyway. And what began to unravel when they did was a story so much larger and so much older than the disappearance of two girls from a foggy street corner that investigators would later say. It felt less like solving a cold case and more like turning over a stone and finding an entirely different world underneath it. Thomas Vale was 53 years old at the time of the community center encounter. He had lived, for the previous 11 years, in a coastal town approximately 320 miles south of Harroway's Point. Before that, the record of his movements was fragmentary and inconsistent, multiple addresses in different states, different professions listed on different documents, a paper trail that doubled back on itself and contradicted itself in ways that suggested it had been constructed carefully rather than accumulated naturally. Before the name Thomas Vale, there had been, investigators eventually determined, at least two other names. The details of those identities are part of the ongoing prosecution and cannot be fully disclosed here. What can be said is that the man who called himself Thomas Vale had a history of movement, a history of reinvention, and a history of appearing in places without a clearly traceable origin story, and then disappearing again. He was not a registered sex offender. He had no criminal record under the name Thomas Vale or under either of the earlier names that investigators were able to confirm. He had, by every external measure, been a functional and unremarkable member of every community he had ever lived in. He held jobs. He paid taxes. He enrolled the two girls who lived with him in school under the names Rachel and Lily Vale. He attended school events. He coached for one season a youth swimming team. He was, in short, the nightmare scenario that investigators and child safety advocates describe when they explain why the absence of a criminal record provides no actual reassurance. Someone who does harm and then reconstructs himself so thoroughly that the harm becomes invisible. How he came to have two 7-year-old girls in his custody on October 14th, 2009, was the central question. It remains, as of the time of this recording, a question that the legal proceedings are still fully exploring. What investigators established early and conclusively is that Thomas Vale was not related to Abigail and Hannah Reed by blood, adoption, guardianship, or any other legally recognized bond. He had no legitimate claim to those children. None whatsoever. The question of exactly how he obtained them, how he was present on that foggy street corner at that specific moment, whether he had been watching the family, whether there was planning involved, how long he had been in Harroway's Point before that day. All of it became the scaffolding of a criminal case that federal prosecutors described, in their initial filing, as one of the most methodically executed child abduction cases they had ever encountered. Rachel and Lily Vale, which is to say, Abigail and Hannah Reed, were 22 years old on the night of the community center encounter. They were adults. They had been adults for 4 years. They had been raised from the age of 7 by a man they called their father in a household that was, by their own accounts, functionally normal in most of the ways that matter to a child. He had not, as far as investigators could determine in the early stages, been physically abusive. He had enrolled them in school. He had taken them to doctors and dentists. He had attended their school plays and driven them to extracurricular activities. He had, by the accounts they gave, done the things that parents do. He had also told them their mother was dead. He had told them they had no other family. He had told them, and this emerged gradually over multiple interviews, a version of their own history so complete and internally consistent that neither of them, in 15 years, had ever had a reason to question it. They had been taken at 7, which is old enough to have real memories but young enough for those memories to be gradually replaced, recontextualized, and eventually absorbed into a new story about who you are and where you come from. They did not, they said, remember Harroway's Point. They did not remember a yellow house on the corner near the marina. They did not remember their mother's face or the sound of their father's laugh or the way the fishing boats looked coming in from the water in the early morning. They had some early memories, fragments, impressions, images that did not attach to places or names, but nothing that had ever presented itself to them as evidence of another life. They remembered the bracelets being given to them. They remembered being told, with great tenderness, that the bracelets had been their mother's and that she had wanted them to have them as a reminder that she loved them. He had given them as a final cruelty, a piece of their mother's love story, rewritten as evidence of her absence. The DNA confirmation came 11 days after the community center encounter. The results were unambiguous. Abigail and Hannah Reed were alive. They were 22 years old. They were standing in a county family services office 320 miles from the town where they were born, looking at a social worker who was trying to find a way to tell them, kindly and carefully, that everything they had believed about their own lives was a lie. Clare and Daniel Reed were notified by phone at 7:43 in the morning on a Tuesday. Clare was at her kitchen table. Daniel was pouring coffee at the counter. The call came from the lead federal investigator on the case, a woman named Wren whose professionalism had, throughout the preceding 11 days, been the only thing that kept Clare functional. "The DNA is confirmed," Wren said. "Both girls, they're yours." Clare Reed did not speak for a very long time. Daniel had crossed the kitchen and was holding both her hands by the time she said anything at all. What she said, according to Daniel, was, "I knew it was them. I knew from the moment I saw those bracelets. I knew it was them." Thomas Vale was arrested that same Tuesday morning at the house he had lived in for 11 years, at the moment his daughters left for work. The arrest was conducted by a team of 12 federal agents who had been staged outside his property since 4 in the morning. He offered no resistance. He said nothing at the time of arrest, and he continued to say nothing through his initial processing and arraignment. His attorney issued a statement describing the charges as premature and based on an incomplete understanding of a complex family situation, which was the kind of statement that prosecutorial teams tend to regard as a promising sign for their own case. He was charged with 2 counts of kidnapping, 2 counts of custodial interference, and additional federal charges related to transporting minors across state lines. The charges carried, in combination, the potential for a sentence that would keep Thomas Vale in federal custody for the rest of his natural life. The arraignment was covered by every regional news outlet and several national ones. The photograph that ran in most of the coverage showed a man of medium height with neat gray hair and the expression of someone who has decided to perform normalcy so thoroughly that it has become his only available face. He looked in that photograph like a retired accountant, like someone's mild-mannered neighbor, like exactly no one you would look at twice. That, of course, was the point. What followed the confirmation and the arrest was not, as it is sometimes portrayed in the kind of stories that prefer clean endings, a simple reunion of joy. The reunion of Clare and Daniel Reed with their daughters was real, and it was profound, and there are no words in any language that adequately describe what it is to hold in your arms a person you believed you might never see again. Those who were present for that meeting have said, consistently and with considerable restraint, that it was one of the most affecting things they have ever witnessed. But it was also enormously complicated. Rachel and Lily, Abigail and Hannah had spent 15 years building a life. They had memories, relationships, identities, histories. They had graduated from a high school 300 miles away. They had friends they had grown up with. They had part-time jobs. Lily had recently started a 2-year program at a community college. Rachel had been saving to travel. They were adults with fully formed selves, and those selves had been constructed inside a story that had just been dismantled entirely. The psychological literature on cases involving long-term abduction and false identity is not comforting. The process of reconciling two competing histories, the real one and the constructed one, is not a process that happens quickly or without significant pain. The two women had not asked to be taken. They had not asked to be lied to. They had not asked for any of the choices that had been made for them when they were 7 years old. And they had not asked, in the clearest possible terms, to have their entire understanding of their own lives overturned on a Saturday night at an art fair by a woman they had never seen, before holding up a photograph on her phone. They were, in short, victims, in ways that were not always straightforward to recognize, because the harm that had been done to them did not look like the harm that most people imagine when they hear the word kidnapping. But it was harm nonetheless. Profound, lasting, identity-level harm. The work of building something new, something that honored both the real history and the lived experience, something that made space for Clare and Daniel without demanding that the previous 22 years be erased. That work was slow and difficult, and required a great deal of professional support for everyone involved. It required patience of a kind that Clare Reed, to her extraordinary credit, proved capable of sustaining even when it cost her. She did not demand. She did not rush. She made herself available and she waited. She had, after all, become very good at waiting. There is a detail in this story that I have returned to repeatedly in the months since I first encountered it, and I think it is worth sitting with before we move toward the end. The bracelets. 4 pairs were made by a jeweler in Astoria, Oregon, in December of 2008. 1 pair for the girls. 1 pair kept by Clare and Daniel. Daniel wore his on his right wrist. Clare kept hers in a wooden box on the top shelf of the closet. 1 pair sold to a family whose records confirmed they still had them, and whose whereabouts were verified in the early weeks of the investigation. And 1 pair whose buyer the jeweler could not trace. For 15 years, that 4th pair was the one unanchored thread, the ghost in the evidence file, the thing that should have led somewhere and didn't. And then a woman reached for a ceramic bowl in a community center on a rainy Saturday night in October, and the thread pulled itself taut. Investigators, in the course of building the case against Thomas Vail, traced the purchase of that 4th pair of bracelets. He had bought them. He had bought them in December of 2008, 10 months before he took the girls. The jeweler had no useful record, but a financial investigator found the transaction in the meticulous reconstruction of Vail's financial history that the federal team undertook. He had paid in cash, which is why the jeweler's credit record held nothing, but the bank withdrawal of the relevant amount on the relevant day. Cross-referenced with the jeweler's sales log and the specific nature of the commission, placed him in that shop, buying that specific piece of jewelry, 10 months before Abigail and Hannah Reed disappeared. He had planned it. He had planned it for at least 10 months. He had bought the bracelets at custom jewelry that matched the ones the girls already owned, ordered specifically, paid for specifically, before he had taken the children. The investigators on the case have said, carefully and within the bounds of what they can disclose before trial, that the timeline of his presence in Harroway's Point and the timeline of his preparation suggest a level of premeditation that they rarely encounter. Most child abductions are crimes of opportunity or impulse. What Thomas Vail did was something else, something that required time and attention and a level of deliberate planning that is, frankly, terrifying to contemplate. He had given those girls the bracelets on the night of October 14th, 2009, as the first act of building his story. As the first stone in the false architecture of the life he intended to construct around them. He had taken something that belonged to their real family and turned it into a prop for his fiction. And that fiction had held for 15 years, until it walked through the door of a community art fair and stood 15 feet from the one person in the world who would recognize it. Clare Reed gave one formal interview in the months following the arrest to a regional newspaper that had covered the original disappearance extensively. She answered questions carefully and without excess. She was asked what she wanted people to understand about the case. She thought for a long moment before answering. "I want people to understand that giving up is a choice," she said. "I made a different choice. Every single day I made a different choice. And I am not telling you that because I think I deserve credit for it. I am telling you that because somewhere out there right now, there is a parent who has been told to let go, to accept that the answer is not coming, to find a way to live with not knowing. And I want that parent to know that the answer can come. It can come 15 years later on a rainy Saturday night in a room full of strangers. You cannot know when, you cannot know how, but you do not have to stop believing that it can." She was also asked what it felt like to see her daughters for the first time. She was quiet for a long time after that question. "They look like their grandmother," she finally said. "My mother, she's been gone for 6 years. She didn't get to know. And when I looked at them, the first thing I thought was that I needed to call my mother to tell her. And then I remembered that I couldn't. And I thought she would have been so glad. I thought at least one of us got to be glad." The legal proceedings against Thomas Vale are ongoing. He has entered a plea of not guilty on all charges. The trial is expected to be lengthy and complex, involving decades of financial records, forensic analysis of multiple residences, the testimony of numerous witnesses across several states, and the testimony of the 2 women who grew up believing he was their father. The question of what to call Thomas Vale, whether father is a word that applies to someone who performed that role under false pretenses and as part of a crime, is one that Rachel and Lily are navigating in their own way and at their own pace. Neither of them has made public statements. Their privacy is being protected, and appropriately so. They are not characters in a story. They are people. They are, at 22, in the early stages of a process of understanding their own lives that will probably take the rest of those lives to complete. Abigail and Hannah Reed, those are their legal names now, restored to them along with everything else that was taken from them on a foggy afternoon 15 years ago, are in regular contact with their parents. The relationship is being built slowly. It is being built with care. It is, by all accounts, real. Clare Reed has not yet put her daughter's photograph back in the missing persons folder. She updated it instead. Same photograph, different caption. Found. There are thousands of open missing persons cases in the United States at any given moment. Thousands of families in the position Clare and Daniel Reed occupied for 15 years, living inside an unanswered question, maintaining hope against every rational argument for abandoning it, keeping the photographs current and the listings active, and the phone lines open in case something, anything, comes through. Most of those cases do not end the way the Reed case ended. Most of them do not end at all in any satisfying sense. They remain open. They remain unresolved. They are carried by the families who live with them, year after year, as a permanent and unasked-for feature of their existence. But some of them do. Some of them resolve. Some of them have a rainy Saturday night in a community center and a woman who reaches for a ceramic bowl and looks across a room and sees something that should not be there. And that is worth remembering. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children operates a tip line that can be reached at 1-800-800-98868. If you have information about a missing person, any case, no matter how old, that line is staffed around the clock by people whose entire professional purpose is to follow up on exactly the kind of thread that cracked this case open. You do not have to be certain, you just have to call. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story here at Cold Crime Case. If this case moved you, and I believe it moved every single one of you who stayed with it from the beginning, then I am asking you to do something right now. Like this video. Leave a comment below and tell me what part of this story hit you hardest. Was it the 15 years? Was it the bracelets? Was it what Clare Reed said in that interview, that giving up is a choice and she made a different one? Tell me. I read every single comment on this channel. Every one. And subscribe. Please subscribe. We tell the stories that need to be told, the ones where the families deserve to be heard, where the victims deserve to have their names spoken aloud. We do not move on until we have honored every detail, and we come back week after week because this work matters. The Reed family's story is not over. The trial is coming. And when it does, Cold Crime Case will be right here with you, following every development, making sure that Thomas Vale's name is attached permanently to what he did, and that the names Abigail and Hannah Reed are attached permanently to the fact that they survived it. That they came home. This is Cold Crime Case. We go where the evidence leads. We stay until we find the truth. And we never ever stop. See you in the next one. Cold Crime Case. Because every victim deserves to be remembered. If you or someone you know has information about a missing person, contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children at 1-800-800-98868 or visit missingkids.org.